I died on a Tuesday, though no one could say precisely how. The house remembered, I think, even if the living chose to forget. My name was Eleanor Hartley, and I had been the governess at Thornwood Hall for 3 years when I first understood what it meant to be seen. Not acknowledged, mind you, for I had always been acknowledged in the perfunctory way servants are acknowledged, with polite nods and distant gratitude, but to be truly seen. To have someone look at you as though you were not merely a function, but a person, a soul with desires and dreams and a heart that could break, that was something I had never known until him. His name was William Ashford, eldest son of the house, 26 years old and intended for the church. He had returned from his studies at Oxford that autumn, his ordination only months away, and the house had hummed with preparation for the life he was meant to lead. A life of devotion and sacrifice, his mother said. A life of dignity and moral certainty, his father insisted. But when William looked at me across the morning room where I taught his younger sister her lessons, I saw something else entirely. I saw a man who did not yet know what he wanted, only that he had never been asked. The first time he spoke to me, truly spoke to me, it was raining. I had taken little Catherine to the conservatory to draw the ferns, and he found us there among the glass and greenery, the sound of rain drumming overhead. He asked what we were studying, and I explained the structure of the fronds, the way they unfurled from tight spirals into graceful arcs. He listened as though I were delivering a sermon, and when Catherine grew bored and wandered off to chase a moth, he remained. We spoke of small things at first, books, weather, the way light changed in autumn. But beneath those small things lived larger ones, unspoken and trembling. I felt them in the way his voice softened when he said my name, in the way his hand hesitated near mine when he passed me a volume of poetry he thought I might enjoy. I felt them in my own chest, a tightness and a longing I had no right to feel. It was Father Callum who noticed first. He was the family priest, a stern man in his 50s who had guided the Ashfords through christenings and confirmations and confessions for 2 decades. He had a way of watching people, of cataloging their sins before they had even committed them, and he watched William and me with eyes that missed nothing. I remember the morning he arrived unannounced and found us walking together in the garden, speaking of nothing in particular, simply walking. His face darkened as though he had witnessed something obscene, and he called William aside with a voice that left no room for refusal. I did not hear what was said, but I saw William's face when he returned, pale, shaken, his jaw tight with suppressed anger or shame, or both. He did not speak to me for 3 days after that, and when he finally did, it was only to apologize for his absence. He did not explain. He did not need to. We both understood that whatever had been growing between us had been seen, named, and condemned. Still, we could not help ourselves. Love, I have learned, does not obey the rules set for it. It grows in shadows and silence, in stolen glances and accidental touches, in the terrible hope that perhaps, somehow, the world might make room for it. William began leaving books for me in the library, small volumes of verse with pages folded at particular poems. I left pressed flowers in return, tucked between the pages where I knew he would find them. We spoke less, but we said more. Every gesture was a word, every silence a confession. Father Callum grew more vigilant. He began visiting Thornwood Hall more frequently, always appearing when William and I happened to be in the same room. He spoke to William in low, urgent tones, and I caught fragments of his warnings. Temptation, duty, the immortal soul, the scandal that would destroy not only William's future, but the family's standing in the county. He spoke of me, too, though never to my face. I heard the word governess spoken with disdain, as though my position were not a respectable occupation, but a moral failing. I heard the word woman used like an accusation. Winter came early that year, and with it a coldness that had nothing to do with the weather. William grew distant, trapped between what he felt and what he had been taught to believe. I saw the strain in his face, the way he avoided my eyes as though looking at me might undo him entirely. His mother began speaking more openly of his ordination, of the parish that awaited him, of the good he would do as a man of God. I understood then that I was not merely inconvenient. I was an obstacle to a future already written, a future in which I had no place. One evening in December, as snow began to fall outside the tall windows of Thornwood Hall, William came to the schoolroom where I was preparing lessons for the following day. He stood in the doorway, his face a mask of anguish, and told me that he had spoken to Father Callum, that he had confessed everything, that the priest had made it clear what must be done. "I cannot marry you," he said, and his voice broke on the words. "I cannot even speak to you as I have been. It is a sin, Eleanor. What I feel for you is a sin, and I must atone for it." I wanted to ask him who had decided that love was sinful, who had the authority to name desire as transgression, but I said nothing. I only nodded, my hands folded tightly in my lap, and watched as he turned and left the room. I heard his footsteps fade down the corridor, and I sat alone in the dim light of a single candle, feeling the walls of Thornwood close around me like a tomb. Father Callum came to see me the next morning. He did not sit, did not soften his expression with any pretense of kindness. He told me that my position at Thornwood Hall was no longer appropriate, that my influence on the household, particularly on William, had become a concern. He suggested, in words that were not suggestions at all, that I seek employment elsewhere. He offered to write a reference, cold and minimal, that would allow me to find another post far from this county, far from the Ashford family, far from the man I loved. I packed my belongings that same day. 2 trunks, a few books, the pressed flowers I had kept hidden in a wooden box. I did not see William again before I left. His mother informed me, with brittle politeness, that he had gone to stay with Father Callum for a time, to prepare his heart and mind for the vows he would soon take. I was given a month's wages and a carriage to the village, and as Thornwood Hall disappeared behind the trees, I felt something inside me break cleanly, like a bone snapped in two. I found lodging in the village, a small room above a draper's shop, and I waited. For what? I did not know. A letter, perhaps. An apology. Some sign that what we had shared had meant something beyond scandal and inconvenience. But no letter came, and the winter dragged on, gray and silent. It was in late January that I received word. A message delivered by a boy I did not recognize. A single folded note with my name written in a hand I knew too well. It said only this: "Forgive me." I did not understand. Not then. But 2 days later, I learned that William Ashford had taken his vows and been ordained, and that Father Callum had personally overseen the ceremony. I learned that William would remain at the church near Thornwood, serving the parish where he had been raised, bound now not only by duty, but by sacred vow to a life that did not include me. And I learned, from the whispers that travel faster than any letter, that something had changed in him, that he performed his duties with the fervor of a man seeking penance, that he prayed longer and harder than any priest the village had known, and that he had begun to look ill, drawn and sleepless, as though haunted by something he could not name. I wanted to hate him. I wanted to hate Father Callum, who had poisoned what might have been pure with his suspicion and judgment. But hatred requires energy I no longer possessed. I felt only a deep, aching emptiness, and a question that would not leave me. What had William asked forgiveness for? Loving me or betraying that love? I never found out. Because 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday evening as I descended the narrow stairs from my room to fetch water for tea, I missed a step. Or perhaps the step missed me. The details were never clear. All I remember is the sensation of falling, the sharp crack of my head against the wooden edge, and then a darkness so complete it felt almost kind. They found me at the bottom of the stairs. The landlady said I must have tripped, must have been careless in the dim light. No one questioned it. No one wondered. A governess, alone and out of place, dead in a rented room above a draper's shop, there was no mystery in that, only misfortune. But I did not leave. I do not know why. Perhaps because I had unfinished business, or perhaps because even in death I could not bring myself to abandon the only place where I had ever been truly seen. I lingered, neither here nor fully gone, aware of the world in a way that was both vivid and distant, as though I were watching a play through gauze. And I watched as William, now Father William Ashford, began to unravel. I had not expected death to be so lonely. I had imagined, in the vague way the living imagine such things, that death would bring either peace or oblivion. But I found neither. Instead, I existed in a strange half-state, able to see and hear and feel the world around me, but unable to touch it, unable to make myself known. I was a witness to my own absence, and the cruelty of it was almost unbearable. The first time I returned to Thornwood Hall, I did not intend to. I simply found myself there, drawn by some force I could not name, standing in the garden where William and I had once walked together. The roses had been cut back for winter, their stems bare and skeletal against the gray sky. I reached out to touch one, and my hand passed through it like smoke through air. I felt nothing. I was nothing, but I could see, and what I saw troubled me more than my own condition. William had changed. The man who had once carried himself with quiet confidence now moved through the world like a penitent, his shoulders hunched, his face drawn and pale. He performed his duties at the parish church with mechanical precision, conducting services and hearing confessions and visiting the sick, but there was something hollow in it, something performed rather than felt. I watched him from the shadows of the church, unseen and unheard, and I saw the way his hands trembled when he lifted the chalice, the way his voice faltered on certain prayers. He had taken to staying late in the church after evening services, long after the parishioners had gone home. He would kneel before the altar, his head bowed, his lips moving in silent prayer or perhaps confession. I stood in the back pew and watched him, and I wondered what he was asking forgiveness for. Loving me, or sending me away, or something else entirely. Father Callum noticed, of course. He came to the church one evening and found William still kneeling there, hours after the service had ended. I watched as the older priest approached, his footsteps echoing in the empty space, and laid a hand on William's shoulder. "You are punishing yourself too harshly," Father Callum said, his voice low and firm. "What happened was regrettable, but it is over now. You made the right choice. You chose your vocation, your duty to God. You must let go of this guilt." William looked up at him, and I saw something in his eyes that made my breath catch, though I no longer had breath to catch. It was not guilt alone. It was something darker, something closer to despair. "She is dead," William said, and his voice was raw. "Eleanor is dead. She fell," they said, "in that wretched room where I sent her. Where we sent her." Father Callum's face tightened. "It was an accident. A tragedy, yes, but not your doing. You cannot hold yourself responsible for every misfortune that befalls those who cross your path." But William shook his head, and I saw tears on his cheeks, silver in the candlelight. "I told her I loved her," he whispered. "And then I told her it was a sin. I let you convince me that what I felt was wrong, that she was a temptation to be resisted, and now she is gone. How am I to live with that?" Father Callum's expression hardened, and he withdrew his hand. "You will live with it by remembering your vows, by serving God and the souls entrusted to your care. Grief is natural, but it must not consume you. She was a governess, William. A good woman, perhaps, but not one worth destroying yourself over." I felt a cold rage rise in me, though I had no body to contain it. Not worth destroying himself over, as though my life, my love, my very existence had been measured and found wanting by a man who knew nothing of me except my station. I wanted to scream, to make myself seen, to show Father Callum that I was still here, still watching, still aware of every cruel word he spoke. But I could not. I was powerless, voiceless, a shadow in a world that had already forgotten me. William said nothing more. He simply bowed his head again and resumed his prayers, and Father Callum left him there, alone in the dim church with only the flickering candles for company, and me, of course, though he did not know it. I began to follow William after that, not consciously, not with any purpose, but I found myself wherever he was, as though some invisible thread connected us even in death. I watched him conduct services, his voice steady but his eyes haunted. I watched him visit the homes of the sick and the dying, offering comfort he did not seem to feel himself. I watched him return each night to the small rectory beside the church, where he would sit alone at his desk, staring at the pages of a Bible he did not seem to read. And I watched as strange things began to happen. At first, they were small. Candles that flickered out without cause. The scent of roses in the church, though it was the dead of winter and no flowers bloomed anywhere near. The sound of footsteps in the empty nave, soft and measured, as though someone were walking up the aisle when no one was there. William noticed. I could see it in the way his head would turn sharply toward a sound that had no source, in the way his eyes would search the shadows for something he could not name. Father Callum dismissed these occurrences as drafts and imagination, the natural creaks and sighs of an old building. But William did not seem convinced. He grew more withdrawn, more troubled, and I saw him begin to look over his shoulder as though expecting to find someone standing there. One night, as he knelt before the altar, I felt something shift inside me, a surge of longing, of anger, of grief so intense it felt like a physical force. I wanted him to know I was there. I wanted him to see me, to understand that I had not simply vanished, that what we had shared was not erased by death or vows or the judgment of men like Father Callum. And in that moment of desperate wanting, something happened. The candles on the altar went out, all at once, plunging the church into darkness. William gasped and stumbled to his feet, his breath coming fast. And then, in the silence that followed, a single candle relit itself, its flame steady and bright. "Eleanor," William whispered, and his voice was barely audible. "Is that you?" I wanted to answer. I tried with everything I had, but no words came. I could only watch as he stood there, trembling, staring at the candle as though it held the answer to a question he was afraid to ask. The occurrences grew more frequent after that. Objects moved in the rectory, books falling from shelves when no one was near. The scent of roses grew stronger, almost overwhelming, filling the church until even the parishioners began to remark on it. And William, poor William, began to look like a man haunted not by guilt alone, but by something far more tangible. Father Callum grew alarmed. He came to the church more often, bringing holy water and incense, muttering prayers of protection and cleansing. He told William that the disturbances were the work of an unquiet spirit, something drawn to the church by the strength of William's grief and guilt. He insisted that William must let go, must release whatever hold I had on him, or risk losing himself entirely. But William could not let go. I saw it in the way he spoke to the empty air, in the way he left a chair pulled out at his desk as though expecting someone to sit there, in the way he began to address his prayers not to God, but to me. "Forgive me," he would whisper in the darkness. "Please, Eleanor, forgive me." And I wanted to. God help me, I wanted to forgive him, to release him from the torment I saw eating away at him. But I did not know how. I did not know if forgiveness was even mine to give, or if I was simply a reflection of his guilt, a manifestation of the conscience he could not silence. One evening, as snow fell softly outside the church windows, William did something I had not expected. He went to the altar, not to pray, but to speak. He stood before the crucifix and the candles and the heavy velvet cloth, and he spoke aloud, his voice clear and steady for the first time in weeks. "Eleanor Hartley," he said, "if you are here, if some part of you remains, I need you to know something. I loved you. I love you still. What I did, what I allowed to happen, it was wrong. Not the love, but the denial of it. I let fear and duty and the judgment of others dictate my choices, and in doing so, I destroyed the one thing in my life that felt true. I cannot undo what has been done. I cannot bring you back, but I can honor your memory and I can seek your forgiveness, even if I do not deserve it." I stood in the shadows and listened, and I felt something inside me crack open. Not anger, not grief, but something softer, something closer to sorrow. He had loved me. He still loved me. And that love, however thwarted and tragic, had been real. But Father Callum, standing just outside the church door where William could not see him, heard every word. And the expression on his face was not one of compassion or understanding. It was alarm, and beneath that, something that looked almost like fear. He entered the church and called William's name sharply, and William turned, startled. Father Callum's face was pale, his jaw set. "This must stop," he said, his voice hard. "You are allowing yourself to be consumed by something unholy. This obsession with the dead, this belief that she is somehow present, it is dangerous. You are a priest, William. You have a sacred duty, and you are failing it." William stared at him, and for the first time I saw something like defiance in his eyes. "What if she is here?" he asked quietly. "What if she never left? What if I owe her more than prayers and guilt?" Father Callum stepped forward, his voice rising. "Then you are damning yourself. You are opening the door to forces you do not understand. The dead do not linger unless there is sin, unless there is unfinished business that binds them to this world. If she is here, it is because you will not let her go. And if you continue down this path, you will lose more than your vocation. You will lose your soul." William said nothing. He only turned back to the altar, his shoulders sagging. And Father Callum left the church, his footsteps heavy and angry. I remained, standing in the cold silence, and I wondered if he was right. Was I here because of William's guilt or because of my own? Was I bound to this place by love or by something darker? I did not know. But I knew one thing with terrible certainty. William was unraveling, and I was the cause, and I did not know how to stop it. The weeks that followed were a slow descent into something I can only describe as madness, though I do not know if the madness belonged to William, to me, or to the space between us where the living and the dead should not meet. I began to understand the nature of my existence more clearly. I was not simply observing the world. I was affecting it, shaping it with the force of my emotions and my will. When I felt anger, the candles would flare and sputter. When I felt sorrow, the temperature in the church would drop until frost formed on the windows, even when fires burned in the grates. And when I felt love, when I allowed myself to remember what it had been like to stand beside William in the garden and feel the warmth of his presence, the scent of roses would fill the air so thickly that people crossing themselves and hurrying from the church, whispering of omens and hauntings. Father Callum brought in another priest, a younger man named Father Benedict, who specialized in what he called spiritual discernment. They came to the church late one evening when they thought William was away, and they performed a rite of cleansing, walking through the nave with holy water and incense, speaking prayers in Latin that were meant to drive out unclean spirits and seal the space against supernatural intrusion. I watched them from the shadows, and I felt a sharp, cold fury rise in me. Unclean, as though my love, my very presence, were a stain to be scrubbed away. I wanted to show them that I was not some mindless haunting, not some demon drawn to despair. I was Eleanor Hartley, and I had loved and been loved, and I would not be banished by men who understood nothing of what had passed between William and me. As Father Benedict sprinkled holy water near the altar, I focused all my will on a single candlestick, a heavy brass piece that stood on a side table. I felt the effort like a physical strain, as though I were lifting something with muscles I no longer possessed. And then, with a force that startled even me, the candlestick flew across the room and struck the wall with a deafening clang. Both priests froze. Father Callum's face went white, and Father Benedict made the sign of the cross with trembling hands. They left quickly after that, their prayers unfinished, and I heard Father Callum tell the younger priest that the spirit was stronger than he had anticipated, that more drastic measures might be required. William heard of the incident, of course. News traveled quickly in a small parish. He came to the church that night, alone, and stood in the center of the nave, looking around as though he could see me if he only looked hard enough. "Eleanor," he said quietly, "if that was you, please, I need to understand. Are you here because of me? Because of something I did? Or something I failed to do? I cannot bear this uncertainty. I cannot bear not knowing if you are at peace or if you are suffering because of me." I wanted so desperately to answer him. I moved closer, close enough that if I had been alive I could have reached out and touched his face. And as I did, something extraordinary happened. For just a moment, I think he saw me. His eyes widened, his breath caught, and he stared directly at the space where I stood. "Eleanor," he whispered, and his voice was filled with wonder and terror in equal measure. But the moment passed as quickly as it had come. I flickered like a candle flame in the wind, and he was left staring at empty air, his hand outstretched toward nothing. He sank to his knees, his face in his hands, and I heard him weep for the first time since I had died. Deep, wrenching sobs that echoed through the church, and I knelt beside him, helpless, unable to comfort him or take away his pain. Father Callum found him there an hour later, still kneeling, still weeping, and the older priest's expression was no longer one of concern, but of grim determination. He helped William to his feet and led him away, and I heard him say that something had to be done, that William could not continue like this, that the bishop would need to be informed if matters did not improve. The next day, Father Callum came to the church with a wooden box. Inside were objects I recognized from my studies of folklore and superstition, things meant to bind or banish spirits. Iron nails, salt, a bundle of herbs I could not name. He placed them at the corners of the church, muttering prayers under his breath, and when he reached the altar, he set down a small mirror, its surface dark and reflective. Mirrors were meant to trap spirits, I knew, to confuse them and keep them from moving freely. But as I looked into this one, I saw something that chilled me. I saw my own face, pale and translucent, my eyes dark and hollowed with sorrow. I looked like a ghost. I looked dead. And for the first time since I had fallen down those stairs, I understood fully what I had become. I turned away from the mirror, sickened, and I felt a pull, a terrible force that seemed to draw me toward it, as though it wanted to hold me there, to keep me trapped in its dark surface. I fled the church, if fleeing is what a spirit does, and I found myself back at Thornwood Hall, standing in the schoolroom where I had taught Catherine her lessons, where William had come to me that final evening and told me he could not marry me. The room was unchanged. My books were gone, my few personal belongings removed, but the furniture remained, the small desk and chair, the globe on its stand, the chalkboard with faint traces of the last lesson I had given. I stood there and felt the full weight of my absence, the way the world had simply moved on without me, as though I had never existed at all. But I had existed. I had lived and loved and hoped, and that had to mean something. Even now, even in death, it had to mean something. I returned to the church that night, determined. Father Callum's mirror still sat on the altar, but I did not look at it. Instead, I went to William's rectory, the small house beside the church where he lived alone. He was at his desk, writing something by candlelight, and I could see the strain in his face, the sleepless nights written in the dark circles beneath his eyes. I moved closer, and as I did, the candle flame bent toward me, as though drawn by my presence. William looked up sharply, his pen clattering to the desk. "Eleanor," he said, and this time there was no question in his voice. "I know you are here. I know you have been here all along. Please, if you can hear me, give me a sign. Tell me what you need. Tell me how to help you." I focused all my will on the candle, and slowly, carefully, I made it flicker once, twice, 3 times. William's breath caught, and he stood, his hands gripping the edge of the desk. "Can you forgive me?" he asked, his voice breaking. "For sending you away, for choosing duty over love, for letting fear dictate my choices. Can you ever forgive me?" I wanted to tell him yes. I wanted to tell him that I understood, that I did not blame him, that what had happened was not his fault alone. But I could not speak. I could only make the candle flicker again, a small, uncertain light in the darkness. He took it as an answer. I saw his face crumple with relief and sorrow, and he sank back into his chair, covering his face with his hands. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you." But Father Callum had been watching. I had not seen him standing in the doorway, but he had seen everything, and the expression on his face was not one of compassion or understanding. It was fury. He stepped into the room, his voice cold and hard. "This ends now, William. I will not stand by and watch you destroy yourself over a ghost. She is not here because she loves you. She is here because you will not let her go. And if you continue this madness, I will have no choice but to report you to the bishop. You will lose your position, your vocation, everything you have worked for. Is that what you want?" William looked up at him, and I saw something change in his face. Not surrender, but something harder, something closer to resolve. If loving her is madness, then I have been mad from the beginning, and I will not apologize for it, not to you, not to the bishop, not to anyone." Father Callum stared at him, and I saw something like fear flicker in the older priest's eyes. "Then I will do what must be done," he said quietly, "for your sake and for hers." He left the rectory, and I felt a cold dread settle over me. I did not know what he intended, but I knew it would not be something William or I could endure. And as I watched William sit alone in the candlelight, his face drawn and pale, I wondered if my presence was a gift or a curse, if staying was an act of love or an act of cruelty. I did not know. But I knew that something was coming, something that would force all of us, the living and the dead, to face the truth of what we had done and what we had lost. Father Callum summoned the bishop. I learned this not from William, who had not been told, but from the whispers of the parish, the way servants and parishioners speak when they believe no one important is listening. The bishop was coming to assess the situation, to determine whether William was fit to continue his duties, and to perform what Father Callum delicately called a rite of spiritual liberation. An exorcism, in plainer terms. They intended to drive me out. The bishop arrived on a cold morning in early March, when the last snow still clung to the shadows and the air smelled of thawing earth. He was a tall man with iron-gray hair and a face that showed both intelligence and severity. Father Callum met him at the church, and they spoke in low voices that I could not quite hear, though I caught fragments. Obsession, possession, dangerous attachment, the soul of the deceased in torment. They spoke of me as though I were a problem to be solved, a stain to be removed, and I felt my anger rise like a tide. William was not present. He had been sent away, Father Callum claimed, to visit a sick parishioner in a neighboring village, though I suspected this was a lie meant to keep him from interfering. I searched for him and found him instead at Thornwood Hall, standing in the garden where we had once walked together, his face turned toward the bare rose bushes as though they might offer him some answer. I went to him, and this time I did not hesitate. I gathered all the strength I possessed and focused it into a single desperate effort. The air around him grew cold, so cold that his breath misted white, and the scent of roses bloomed impossibly in the frozen garden. He turned sharply, his eyes scanning the empty space, and I saw recognition dawn on his face. "Eleanor," he breathed, "you are here." I made the branches of the nearest rosebush tremble, a small movement but unmistakable. He stepped closer, his hand outstretched, and for a moment I thought I felt his warmth, a faint echo of what touch had been when I was alive. "They are going to perform an exorcism," he said, his voice urgent. "Father Callum has convinced the bishop that you are a malevolent spirit, that you are tormenting me and binding yourself to this world through sin." I tried to stop them, but they would not listen. "Eleanor, I do not know what will happen, but I need you to know that I will not let them take you from me. Not again." I wanted to tell him that it was not his choice to make, that I did not know if an exorcism could even affect me or what it would mean if it did. But I had no voice, only the wind and the cold and the trembling branches, and I did not know if he understood. He returned to the church that afternoon, and I followed. The bishop and Father Callum were waiting, along with Father Benedict and 2 other priests I did not recognize. They had arranged the church for the ritual, clearing the pews and marking the floor with chalk symbols I did not recognize, though I sensed their purpose. They were meant to contain me, to trap me within a space from which I could not escape. William entered and stopped short when he saw the preparations. His face went pale, and he turned to Father Callum with fury in his eyes. "What is this?" he demanded. "You told me you were simply going to bless the church, to offer prayers for peace. You said nothing of an exorcism." Father Callum's expression was unyielding. "Because you would have tried to stop us. William, you are not in your right mind. You have allowed your grief and guilt to open a door that should never have been opened. This spirit, whatever it may be, is not Eleanor Hartley. It is something that has taken her form to deceive you, to feed on your sorrow. We are doing this to save you." William shook his head violently. "You are wrong. She is here because I failed her, because I let you convince me that love was a sin. And now you want to drive her away again, to silence her as you silenced us both when she was alive. The bishop stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. Father Ashford, I understand that you are in pain, but you must trust that we are acting in your best interest and in the interest of the soul you believe to be lingering here. If Eleanor Hartley is truly present, then she is suffering. The dead are not meant to remain. They are meant to find rest, to move beyond this world. What we are doing is an act of mercy. It did not feel like mercy. It felt like violence. As they began the ritual, chanting prayers in Latin and sprinkling holy water throughout the church, I felt a pressure building around me, a force that seemed to compress the very air. The chalk symbols on the floor began to glow faintly, and I realized with growing horror that they were working. I was being drawn toward the center of the circle they had marked, pulled by a force I could not resist. I fought against it. I lashed out with all the strength I had, and the candles throughout the church exploded into flame, their wicks burning so brightly that the priests shielded their eyes. The windows rattled in their frames, and the temperature dropped so precipitously that frost spread across the stone walls like a living thing. "Stop!" William shouted, his voice raw with desperation. "You are hurting her. Can you not see that? She is afraid." The bishop did not stop. He raised his voice, his prayers growing more forceful, and I felt the pull intensify. I was being torn apart, stretched between this world and something else, some vast emptiness that waited beyond. I did not know if it was heaven or hell or simply oblivion, but I knew with terrible certainty that if I let go, if I allowed myself to be pulled through, I would never return. And then, in the midst of the chaos, something shifted. A memory rose in me, sharp and vivid, something I had not allowed myself to remember until now. The night I died, the stairs, the fall, but it had not been a fall, not an accident. I remembered now, with sickening clarity, the figure standing at the top of the stairs, the hand that had reached out, not to catch me but to push, the voice that had whispered, "This is for the best," before I tumbled backward into darkness. Father Callum. It had been Father Callum. The realization struck me with such force that the supernatural storm I had been creating intensified tenfold. The church shook as though struck by an earthquake. The altar cloth ripped free and flew through the air. The crucifix above the altar tilted and fell, crashing to the floor with a sound like thunder. William saw my fury, felt it in the air, and he turned to Father Callum with dawning horror on his face. "What did you do?" he demanded. "What did you do to her?" Father Callum's face had gone ashen, but his voice remained steady. "I did what was necessary. She would not leave. She would not release you. I went to speak with her, to reason with her, to convince her that she had to go. But she refused. She said she loved you, that she would wait for you, that she did not care if it ruined you. I could not allow it. I could not let her destroy everything you were meant to become." "You killed her," William said, his voice barely a whisper. "You murdered her." Father Callum shook his head, but there was no conviction in the gesture. "It was an accident. I only meant to frighten her, to make her understand the seriousness of her situation. But she stumbled. She fell. I did not intend for her to die." The bishop and the other priests had stopped their ritual. They stood frozen, staring at Father Callum with expressions of shock and revulsion. And I, hovering at the edge of the circle they had drawn, felt something inside me shift, not anger, but a terrible, aching sadness. I had been murdered, not by fate, not by accident, but by a man who believed he was acting in service of God. William moved toward Father Callum, his hands clenched into fists, but the bishop stepped between them. "This is a matter for the authorities," he said quietly. "Father Callum, you will come with me, and you will answer for what you have done." Father Callum did not resist. He looked suddenly old, diminished, his face a mask of grief and guilt. "I never meant," he began, but he could not finish. There were no words that could undo what he had done. The priests led him away, and William was left alone in the ruined church. He stood in the center of the chalk circle, his chest heaving, his face wet with tears. And I stood beside him, no longer fighting the pull of the exorcism, no longer afraid. "Eleanor," he said softly, looking around as though he might see me. "I am so sorry. I am so deeply, unforgivably sorry." And for the first time since I had died, I felt something like peace begin to touch the edges of my consciousness. Not because I had forgiven, but because the truth had finally been spoken. The secret that had bound me to this world had been revealed, and I no longer had to carry it alone. Father Callum was taken into custody by the local magistrate. The bishop, shaken by what had transpired, ordered a full investigation, and the truth came out in pieces, each one more damning than the last. Witnesses came forward, servants from Thornwood who had seen Father Callum visiting my lodgings in the village the night I died. The landlady remembered his voice on the stairs, the sound of an argument, and then the terrible crash that had brought her running. What had been dismissed as an accident was now revealed as something far darker. William stopped performing his priestly duties. He did not formally renounce his vows, but he could not bring himself to stand at the altar where so much deception and tragedy had unfolded. He spent his days instead in quiet solitude, walking the grounds of Thornwood, sitting in the garden where we had once spoken of books and dreams and all the small things that had meant so much. I remained with him, no longer trying to make myself known, simply present. The supernatural disturbances ceased. The candles burned steadily. The air grew warm again, and the scent of roses faded to nothing more than memory. I did not know if this was because I had grown weaker or because I no longer needed to fight to be acknowledged. The truth was known. That had to be enough. Father Callum was tried and found guilty of manslaughter. The judge, moved perhaps by his age and his previous reputation as a man of God, sentenced him not to prison, but to a form of permanent penance. He was defrocked, stripped of his position and authority, and sent to live in a monastery far from the county, where he would spend the remainder of his days in prayer and contemplation. It was, the judge said, a mercy he did not deserve. But Father Callum did not go quietly. Before he was taken away, he petitioned the bishop for one final request. He asked to return to the church at Thornwood, to the altar where he had served for so many years, to offer a public confession and to beg forgiveness from the soul he had wronged. The bishop, reluctant but moved by the gravity of the request, agreed. A date was set, and word spread through the parish. People came, not out of respect, but out of curiosity and perhaps a desire for justice. They filled the pews on that gray April morning, their faces somber, their whispers filling the church like the rustling of dry leaves. William was there, seated in the front pew, his face drawn and pale. He had not wanted to come, I knew, but he had felt he owed it to me, to bear witness to whatever Father Callum intended to say, and I was there, of course, though no one could see me. I stood at the back of the church, watching as the man who had taken my life walked slowly down the aisle. Father Callum looked like a man already dead. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow, his shoulders bent under the weight of guilt and shame. He wore the simple gray robe of a penitent, no longer the black cassock of a priest, and he moved as though each step pained him. When he reached the altar, he knelt, not on the cushioned kneeler reserved for clergy, but directly on the cold stone floor. The bishop stood to the side, his expression unreadable, and the church fell silent. Father Callum bowed his head, and when he spoke, his voice was barely audible, cracked and broken. "I come before God and before this congregation to confess my sin," he said. "I took a life. I took the life of an innocent woman, Eleanor Hartley, who had done no wrong except to love and be loved. I told myself I was acting in the interest of a greater good, that I was protecting a vocation, a calling, a soul, but I was lying to myself. I was acting out of pride and fear, and a belief that I knew better than God what was right and what was sinful." He paused, his hands clasped so tightly that his knuckles were white. "I pushed her. I stood at the top of those stairs, and I pushed her, and I watched her fall. And when she lay broken at the bottom, I told myself it was an accident, that I had not meant for it to happen. But I did mean it. In that moment, I wanted her gone. I wanted the problem she represented to disappear, and so I made it disappear." The congregation stirred, murmurs of shock and revulsion rippling through the pews. William sat motionless, his face buried in his hands. and I stood at the back of the church, feeling something I had not expected. Not satisfaction, not vindication, but a deep and abiding sorrow. Father Callum raised his head, and though he could not see me, he turned his face toward the back of the church as though he sensed I was there. "Eleanor Hartley," he said, his voice breaking, "if your spirit lingers, if some part of you remains, I beg you to hear me. I beg your forgiveness. I know I do not deserve it. I know that what I have done is beyond pardon. But I cannot leave this world. I cannot face whatever judgment awaits me without asking, please, forgive me." The church was utterly silent. Every eye was on the altar, every breath held, as though the congregation itself were waiting for an answer. And I, standing in the shadows, felt the weight of the decision settle over me. I could refuse. I could let him carry his guilt to the grave and beyond, let him suffer as I had suffered, let him know what it was to be trapped and powerless and consumed by regret. It would be just, it would be deserved. But as I looked at him, kneeling there in his gray robe with his head bowed and his hands trembling, I did not see the man who had killed me. I saw a man who had been so afraid of love, so convinced of his own righteousness, that he had destroyed 2 lives in the name of protecting one. I saw a man who had spent his entire life believing he knew the will of God, only to discover that he had been serving his own fear all along. And I realized that holding on to this anger, this need for justice, was the very thing keeping me bound to this world. Not his guilt, but mine. Not his inability to let go, but my own. I moved forward, down the aisle, though no one saw me. I passed William, who sat with his head in his hands, and I wished I could tell him that I had never blamed him, that the love we had shared was the only pure and honest thing in this entire tragic story. I reached the altar and stood before Father Callum, and I thought of all the things I wanted to say, all the accusations and grief and fury I had carried. But in the end, I said nothing. I simply reached out, and though I had no hand to touch him with, I let the presence of my spirit settle over him like a veil. He gasped, his eyes widening, and I knew that in that moment he felt me, truly felt me, not as a ghost or a haunting, but as the woman I had been. And then I let go. I released the anger, the sorrow, the desperate need to be remembered and mourned. I released him, and in doing so, I released myself. The light in the church seemed to shift, growing brighter and softer all at once. I felt a warmth I had not felt since the moment I died, a sense of peace and wholeness that had eluded me for so long. And I knew, with a certainty that transcended understanding, that I was finally free. Father Callum collapsed forward, his forehead touching the stone floor, and he wept. Not quietly, but with great, shuddering sobs that echoed through the church. The bishop moved to help him, but Father Callum shook his head, unable or unwilling to rise. William looked up then, his face wet with tears, and he turned toward the back of the church as though searching for me. I stood there for a moment longer, wanting him to know that I was at peace, that he could let go too. And perhaps he felt it, because his expression softened, and a small, sad smile touched his lips. He rose and walked to the altar, and he knelt beside Father Callum, not to comfort him, but to offer his own prayer. I heard him whisper words meant only for me, words of love and gratitude and sorrow, and I felt them settle into my heart like a benediction. The congregation began to disperse, quietly, respectfully, leaving the 2 men kneeling at the altar. The bishop offered a final blessing, and then he too departed, and the church was left in silence. I took one last look at the place where so much had happened, where love had bloomed and been crushed, where truth had finally been spoken, and forgiveness, however painful, had been given. And then I turned toward the light that called to me, the light that had always been there, waiting. I do not know what came after. I do not know if William remained a priest or left the church to find a life of his own. I do not know if Father Callum found peace or spent the rest of his days tormented by what he had done. But I know that I am no longer bound to that world, no longer a ghost haunting the spaces where I once lived and loved. I am Eleanor Hartley, and I loved and was loved, and that is enough. It has always been enough, and now, finally, I am free.